No Longer an Ugly Australian by Philip J. Campbelltown 2560. Narrated by David Tredinnick. The year was 1966, and my first son was a member of the St George Police Boys Club. Of course, not only were girls not recognised by this and other similar clubs, but for the average Aussie bloke, and I was very average, every Caucasian person from the continent of Europe was a wog, and every person of Asian descent was a chink. I am now ashamed to admit that I, too, was very much of that opinion. I was an ugly Australian. Things began to change when my son decided to join the club's under-8 soccer team. The team had no adult who volunteered to either coach or manage the team. It soon became clear that I should coach the team, even though I had never played the game competitively. In the absence of any other volunteer, it seemed that I should manage it as well. That was the year during which I finished my Diploma of Public Administration, so, presumably, who else should manage anything? During that season, not only the boys, but the adults as well, mingled freely and often. Our team was comprised of roughly 50% who were descended from Australian-born parents and 50% whose parents were of European birth. Many of the latter boys were of Italian descent. As the weeks went by, I discovered that the parents born overseas were not only very nice, decent people, but their values were almost identical to ours. My wife and I, with our son, were invited to a ceremonial religious function at the Marconi Club for one of the boys in the team. We enjoyed the evening very much, and now, from several decades' distance and looking back, I believe that was the turning point. I began thinking along the lines that we Aussies were so far isolated from the rest of the world that we were, in fact, insular. We had no way of knowing how the rest of the world thought, what things they held dear, whether their fears were actually the same as our fears, or any of the other aspects of their life actually had merit in their environment. I wondered how to improve my understanding of these other folk, and decided to start by learning their language, in this case, Italian. I started by buying the book Teach Yourself Italian and trying to work through that. Dismal failure. I did not commit myself enough. After some thought and research, I joined WEA in the Italian class. This class happened to have about 20 people each night, and thus each person's chance to say something in Italian or to make a valuable contribution to the learning of the language was negligible. I decided I had to have an environment where I would have to apply myself and, more importantly, be judged by a qualified person who could give me feedback which would improve my learning. I enrolled in the Bachelor of Arts degree course at the University of New England. This was distance education, as I was resident in Peakhurst, Sydney, and the campus was in Armidale, but each year we would have 2 terms of 6 days of residence at the university, doing face-to-face classes. For the first 3 years, my subject was Italian language and culture, and I loved it. I thrived on the grammar, and my memory for vocabulary was good. The downside was that we did not have the opportunity for conversation, other than during tutorial periods in those 12 days. At the end of the 3 years, I could say almost anything in Italian, but if the response to my talk was in Italian, I could seldom understand it. I spoke to my professor about this, and he replied that the solution was to jump in the deep end. In pursuit of this solution, I enrolled in the Dante Alighieri Language School in Florence, Italy. My time in Florence, 7 weeks, made me fluent in Italian. But it did much more. Exposure to another culture, a foreign land, and no escape to Aussiness showed me how wrong had been my previous attitude to foreigners. When I returned home after that course, I had a completely different outlook. I had been a foreigner in Italy, at first speaking hesitantly to strangers in the street in their language, and I now knew how belittling that could be. Yet in every such case in Florence, I had been indulged, treated kindly, and not looked down on. Of course, over time my wife and I travelled widely and visited many other lands, but Italy remains my favourite. Our perception of foreigners was now different. We enjoyed each change of culture and customs, and were, in turn, welcomed by the inhabitants of these other lands. I had become a changed man. No longer an ugly Australian. The end.